Welcome into the Inside Bassmaster Podcast, episode 104, and we're rounding out our 2022 year. We've got a couple podcast episodes left before we get to Christmas time, when we take maybe a week or two break before 2023 starts. And Ronnie Moore here with my co-host, as usual, Kyle Jessie. And Kyle, I love our pattern of the month episodes that we get to do because it's basically 30 minutes locked in a room with a professional angler and their mindset on whatever month we're talking about. And today we get to bring in Mike Huff to talk a little December fishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is the time of year where, for a lot of the country, unfortunately, you can't go fishing in December. However, where we live, all three of us combined, you can certainly do that in the southeast. And it's really a good time to go fishing. It seems like a lot of guys, even if you can go, hang it up this time of year. But as Mike will likely tell us, it can actually be some of the best fishing all year long.
Yeah, Mike, I wanted to start it off with, winter fishing is probably my kryptonite. I'm a skinny guy. I know you're a skinny guy as well. My hands don't have much meat on the bones. I can't stand the cold weather. And so that is a huge deterrent for me, is mentally staying in the game. When you're preparing for a day of fishing, and normally when the weather's bad in December, that's when they're biting the best. It's never when it's a sunny bluebird day and it's 45 that they're biting. It's always when it's raining. It's always something else. So what's your mindset when you go to even hook up the boat and head to the lake when it's a day of the week that's in December?
First of all, look at the forecast, but as fishermen, it really doesn't even matter. We're going to go no matter what. But you got to bundle up to start with. Like you said, your hands. Like my hands get really cold when I'm fishing, and I've got these gloves where I can flip them back and forth, where you got your thumbs out. That's important. And I'm sponsored by Blackfish. This is a great time to plug them. They have some of the best cold weather gear. They're out of Minnesota, so they know cold weather stuff. So I've been really happy with them. Just a hoodie like the one I got on right now is awesome. But yeah, staying warm is a big part of it, because you guys know, you're out there, windy, cold. You may not be getting a bite, and adrenaline starts pumping when you catch one. You'll warm up, but other than that, it's hard to stay out there and stay warm when they're not biting.
Especially when you
go ahead.
I was gonna say, especially when you get that adrenaline running or flowing, and you go to scoop one, and you realize your whole arm's wet, and the water's about 40 degrees. And you're like, "Oh, that was a mistake."
Yeah, and you got your glove on. You're like, "Dang, now it's soaking wet. You're cold 10 minutes from now." I mean, it's just You
got to hang your glove on your trim tab and hopefully it dries out for a minute. But I talked to Paul Mueller about this a few years ago, because he fishes for anything and everything all times of the year, drilling through the ice, whatever. And he said one of the biggest mistakes anglers make is when they leave their house or they leave their hotel room and they get in the truck, they turn the heated seats on, they turn the heat on in the truck to get warm, because that's how we want to comfortably be. But he says as soon as you do that, if you're bundled up a little bit, you start to sweat, maybe you start to get a little your elevated body temperature, and the second you leave that cold hits you so much worse. Or if you do sweat a little, it's going to freeze on you. It just makes you immediately go from the warmest you're going to be all day to the coldest. So he says he'll ride in the truck with no heat on for a couple minutes, and he'll have just a shirt, and then he'll put his bibs on when he gets out of the truck. And so it's a whole deal. But have you seen that? That's a big mistake people do, is relying on maybe hand warmers, getting too warm, even though we want to try to stay warm.
That's a mistake I've definitely made a lot. And I gotta credit my cousin, because he'll start off in just jeans and a t-shirt. It's 30 degrees outside. I'm like, what are you doing? So he can start to layer up. And by the time you got all your clothes and your bibs on, he's just warming, like you said, if you go into your truck and try to get hot again and go back out, it's just miserable. It makes it even worse. So the smart thing to do is the least amount of clothes you can have. Start off with that, because you can always warm up.
Well, Kyle, he lives in a great spot of the country. We talked about this in our text, but that East Tennessee, and he's in Kentucky, but just above that, not far from all of those East Tennessee lakes. So Mike, what's your thoughts when it comes to targeting one species versus another? All those lakes around there have smallmouth, and they also have largemouth, but I feel like largemouth are much more fun to target maybe in the pre-spawn all the way through the fall, but in the winter, largemouth can just be annoying. versus smallmouth, where if you do find smallmouth in the winter when it's cold, you can normally catch a bunch of them, or they don't get as tightened up with the cold water as largemouth maybe do.
Yeah, you're exactly right. This time of year, like Kyle said earlier, like a lot of guys are hunting, so you can go out and you can have the lake to yourself. But I feel like smallmouth are a little easier to target this time of year because they get grouped up. They're used to they love the cold weather, cold water, and a lot of the times you can once you find one or a small group of them, you can just run that pattern all over the lake. That's kind of what we've done over the years fishing Cherokee and Cumberland and Laurel. Uh, it's really something you can pattern.
Yeah, and that's one thing thinking about the lakes that you fish a lot, the lakes near you. I've told you this before. I know me and you just chatting, but my dad and his whole side of the family is over there in East Tennessee and had a lot of, opportunity to fish over on those lakes during the winter time, like during Christmas breaks and things like that. Just talk to me a little bit about the transition, because a lot of times, depending on how, warm or cold the fall is, talk about like where those fish go from December maybe to those colder nights, colder days, where you start seeing those fish transition to versus maybe the November and the fall months. Like where are some of the first places you'll look once you feel like those fish are making the transition?
Yeah, it's from November to December. Really, it changes so much. I've seen it like you're catching them on a topwater spook one week, and then the next week they are out here in 30, 40 foot. So it's interesting. I think the main thing though, Kyle, is they follow the shad. Um, Once the water temperature gets below 55, I would say somewhere in there, shads start to go out a little deeper into the thermocline area. Um, Most of the time, I'll catch them 30 to 40. Even some guys catch them in 50, but that especially on Cherokee, the seems like the 30 to 40 range is always really good. But it all depends on the weather, really. I've seen it in December where we're still catching them up on the bank. Um, but most of the time, that December change, water gets down 55 below is what we like to say, and they'll start to go on to that, a silver buddy, Demiki rig, things like that, Ned rig. Um, but some fish will stay on the bank all year, but most of the time that's where they transition to.
Well, and one thing about that in East Tennessee, I was just down at Chickamauga with Jacob Fouts for a few hours shooting some content, and it's in the drawdown transition. That's what today's Tackle Tip Tuesday is about, is that drawdown transition. And in the Tennessee River at Chickamauga, it's about 6 feet. But when you're talking about those fish will stay on the bank, when you're at Cherokee or a place like that, the bank that we know in May is not the bank that we know in November and December, because what is it, 35 to 40 feet that Cherokee will go down. And so I think we had an elite there in February in 2017, and we had a college event there in May of 2017. And there was 40 extra feet of water when it was full pool and flooded in the bushes versus in February. And so, yeah, walk us through that drawdown process. How gradual is it in the fall? And then obviously in the December time period, it probably stabilizes, or maybe even before that, and it's going to be the same depth or the same water level. And if that's the case, do those fish get more comfortable? Whereas we think they're going to be more comfortable with warmer water, but even though it's getting colder, the one thing that's staying stable is the level, and they can now operate where they're going to be for a while.
Yeah, that's the main thing with that. As Cherokee falls, it falls pretty slow. They usually start in July and drop it, weekly. But I think the main thing with that, especially in the wintertime, is this how stable the water level is. If it comes up too fast or it drops too fast, it seems like the fish just kind of shut off. But I think it's always the best when it's as low as it'll go, because there's areas where guys catch them every winter. You'll have the exact rock that's in 33 feet. It's going to be at that depth when the level is all the way down. So I think that's when, especially Cherokee is the best. Douglas the same way. I'm sure Skylar knows a lot more about Douglas than me, but he'll tell you the same thing. When it gets as low as it's going to go and it gets stable, that's usually when it's the best.
Well, before we transition away from that drawdown, Kyle, I wanted to ask, how much do you learn, even though it's a place like Cherokee or a place like Douglas that you fish a lot and you know those places, or even a Cumberland? I don't know what it's like. I know the banks are, the lake sets up differently than a Cherokee does, but seeing a lake on drawdown, when I go over I-40 and I go over Douglas and I see, that whole right side, not the bluff wall bank, but that whole side is just a huge flat with ditches run through it. There's a little bit of water on it. There's not a lot of water on it, all that stuff. But what do you learn every year when you go and fish at drawdown? Because you're gonna get different looks across the entire lake, and it's gonna teach you about what it's gonna look like maybe when it's 5 feet higher or 10 feet higher, and know what that playing field. Rarely do we get to suck the bottom out of a lake and see what it actually looks like. We always have to interpret with side imaging and things like that.
But I mean, honestly, like I know we're talking about the winter time fishing, but most of my, really good summer spots I've found when it's 25 degrees and snow, and I'll ride around the lake and mark every brush pile, every rock that I see that's isolated. So that's really how we found a lot of good summer spots, is when the lake's down like that. But I feel like even in the wintertime when it's pretty low, and you kind of know, as far as having your electronics nowadays, how the contour is set up, the bowls that are in 30 foot, but you learn more about summer fishing when it's drawn down, honestly.
So you're not going to dig out the dredger right now, but 7 months from now, it's game on.
Exactly. I'm like, yeah, that's going to be a good spot in the summertime. Sometimes we'll forget about it and be like, what is this waypoint here? And just make a cast on it and catch one. So, oh, forgot about that one.
So I do want to bring something up. So I know it wasn't obviously in December, but one of, the most popular catches over the last, 4 or 5 plus years was your catch. I want to say it was at Chickamauga on the Finesse jig on the Bluff wall. And it seems like to me, and this is a lot of my experience fishing the White River Lakes, things like that, bluff walls and bluff ends tend to be a really good place to go just to get bites. It might not be, your, intuitive getting out there and Damiki rigging or finding different places, but it seems like that's a high percentage area on lakes that have bluff walls, just to go and fish. So talk a little bit about that, maybe some of the baits you throw and why fish like those bluff walls.
Absolutely. That Chickamauga, that was the luckiest cast I've ever made, Kyle. Anyway, that's bluff walls are always like, that's how I started before I really, learned a lot more about offshore fishing, is bluff walls in the wintertime. Like you said, it's the most consistent place to get bites.
Sure.
Everybody knows about it and still fishes them, and there's still fish on them. I think mainly because they can move up and down easily. They still have the deep water there. It's all channels, so just a high percentage area. But I usually throw a Finesse jig, even in the wintertime, fall and wintertime, on bluffs. And something that's really been forgot about that we still catch fish on bluff walls is a float and fly in the wintertime. And that's I'm glad everybody, started throwing the A-rig on bluff walls. That's pretty common, but you can come behind people and catch some good ones on a float and fly too. And that and even tight lining, when the water gets super, super cold. We've caught a lot tight lining on Cherokee and Cumberland, things like that. But those are really my favorite bluff wall baits. I don't want that float and fly thing to get out, but I'm not sure how many people have a 10-foot rod anymore.
Yeah, or I can't even know how to do it. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say. I like that brought the biggest smile to my face, because I remember when I was a kid, my dad, did that a good bit over on Cherokee, but we actually did that on Lake Washita a few times in the wintertime. Ronnie can attest to this. He's fished there, obviously. Some of those big bluff walls, and caught them there. And it was just such a, to me, having no real idea as a kid, like what we were doing. I'm just sitting there thinking we're just wasting time. And then that cork goes down and it's a 3-pound largemouth. And you're like, oh my gosh, like what is going on? But That
It
really
takes you
is.
back to your childhood, using a bobber. It's fun.
It does. And especially when you catch a big one on a 10-foot or an 8.5-foot rod, that's
Yeah.
a flimsy old,
Yeah.
basically crappie rod more or less. But
It's
That's
a
what
lot of fun.
the float and fly and tight lining. We saw Brandon Lester at Table Rock in the Opens Championship back in 2018. He was tight lining and he had a top 5 finish there, I believe, as well. Won the points race because of that technique at the end of the year. But and he's a Tennessee guy as well. But the float and fly and the tight lining deal, they kind of, to me, it is the Demiki rig and the forward facing sonar baits before they were. Like, that's what you did when you weren't quite sure where they were in the column, but it was a suspended bait, but it didn't have to be a jerk bait. It was a way to be finesse and present something to them. But now we have that immediate feedback with forward facing sonar and using Demiki rigs. And really, tell me a little bit about how effective that has been. I mean, obviously we heard about the Demiki rig in 2017 and it's been known in that area forever. But now it seems like we fish it all the time, what we would consider a Demiki rig. But I know that there's some subtleties that made it a killer in cold water. But now with the technology, we can find them in all water temperatures with our graphs and that technique.
Yeah, I was gonna say that before forward facing sonar, that was what we did, float and fly, tight line and things like that, where you didn't know where they were, but you just, through, like you said, through the middle of the water column. But now that has changed so much with forward facing sonar. It's unbelievable. I mean, you can literally get on a bluff wall and make that cast and count it down and see where that fish is and watch it. You don't even need to count it down now. You just watch the bait, and I mean, it's definitely changed everything. So I mean, if you don't have forward facing sonar now, I mean, you're just fishing for second, basically. Definitely changed.
That's the thing, Ronnie, and I want to interrupt there because what you mentioned is a really good point, and I'd never really thought about it that way, with those techniques basically being targeting those fish that are sitting somewhere in the middle of the water column. I mean, for somebody like Ronnie and I that don't have forward facing on our boat because we're not competing for any tournaments anyways, like, that's a good way to go out there. And if you have it, naturally you're in a huge advantage. Clearly, I mean, there's in this style of fishing, there's really no replacement for it. But I mean, for those that don't have forward facing sonar, this is a really, really good way to go catch those fish without having to do that. And I think that's a great point, because I think that the majority of people definitely have it now, but those that don't, I mean, you can still catch them. It's just different.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's my dad. He finally got on the forward facing sonar deal, but he's still like, he will whoop me with a float and fly and a Ned rig right behind me. Like, that's just one of the best ways to catch them this time of year. If you don't have the forward facing sonar, they'll still bite.
And that's what I was going to say, was you can still use that with it, because it's going to be a different approach at a certain point. When we were throwing big plugs on the Tennessee River, they got conditioned to it. So then you got to throw a silent plug. And now you got to start out with just a worm when they get heavily pressured. With these fish, we're starting to pressure fish that never got a lot of pressure. They might have had baits thrown at them or near them, but not on them, to annoy them, to get them to bite, things like that. And now with the Demiki rig, or a jig head minnow is what I'm referring to it as, any kind of ball head jig with a piece of plastic on it that can drop down to a certain level and keep it there. At a certain point, that's going to be an intrusive bait, even though it doesn't make noise. It's nothing crazy. It's just subtle in their face. They're seeing so many of those things that maybe a float and fly does still have a place, or some of these other things still do have a role in that. Have you seen that a little bit over the last couple of winters when you've gone fishing, that the fish that used to bite on those 33-foot deep rocks in Cherokee and in the bowls and the ditches, man, they get a little smarter. They don't rise up out of that mud as quickly as they used to for it.
No, I've definitely seen that. Like, I just feel like fish over time just adapt to what we're doing, and over time the Demiki deal has gotten tougher and tougher and tougher. We've had to do some little subtle changes and things like that. But one
Do tell.
If you want to, this is the floor is yours.
I'm sure everybody knows, tying a different type of knot, things like that, just little we even, my cousin, he'll dye the tail of his Damiki, change the actual bait you're putting on the jig head, change the size of the jig head, just things like that. But even now we've started using more of a drop shot instead of just a straight lead head. You can see it pretty good if you use a long leader with your drop shot. You can see it a little better, but just things like that. But still, the fish just get used to it, and over time, I feel like the fish that aren't pressured that much are the ones just swimming up on the bank. I think it's going to transition back to that.
Those are the ones Ronnie and I are fishing for. Yeah.
Yes, I feel like eventually it's going to be, back. Well, we're beating the banks again. That's how you're going to have to win a tournament. So it just changes, but float and fly, that's going to be a constant bait. It's always going to be good. So.
But before we get off the Damiki rig technique, you and I actually just spoke, I don't know, a week or two ago about this for an article coming on Bassmaster Magazine in January. A couple of things I wanted to hit on. So there was two things you and I talked about that I felt like were really interesting. One being that we've talked about forward-facing sonar this whole time, but the reality of it is 2D with a Damiki rig is actually kind of the deal. And that was something I heard from more guys than just yourself. Kind of explain that, why 2D is still so important with that. And then also, I remember you telling me a specific tip about how to know how far off the bottom your bait is. And if you mind telling that, because I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, that's something I learned from some guys that are really good with it. Is you'll drop your Damiki down all the way to the bottom, hits the bottom. Your line goes slack. So you basically reel your slack up and touch the tip of your rod to the water, to the top of the water. And you can lift your rod up so you know exactly how far off the bottom your Damiki is. And, as far as the 2D sonar, I mean, that's you're dropping straight down on those fish. And that's really the best way to see them, in my opinion. So you can, you're looking at that rock, you drop your Damiki down, your bait hits the bottom, you can pull it up and you know exactly how far off, you are on that rock. So that's just what I learned about it. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever when the guy showed me that. And it really works. I mean, that's
Sure.
the best way I've found to catch them.
I mean, you just think about it, like that distance between the water and where your rod tip is at.
Yeah.
That's how far off the bottom it is. And when he told me that, it was like, it was like, well, that's so simple.
It's so simple, but it's so interesting,
Think about it.
I thought he was going to say he puts his rod tip to the water and then he gets a Sharpie and goes down in each eye of the thing or something. So he knows when he has marked line. No.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that, you mentioned the Damiki rig, obviously. You got to be a little bit more patient with it in the winter. I feel like you got to get it near it. But I just remember Jesse Wiggins just sitting there painfully, like it's almost like you get it down near there or where you think they are, and you just got to like close your eyes or just like look away and don't move your arm. It's like that thing on Instagram where they're like, it scans your hand and you try to keep your hand as still as possible. And they're like, what job do you do? And it's like with a fisherman that does a Damiki rig, you got to be completely still sometimes just for it to hover there long enough and get that. So have you seen, is there like we kind of get impatient now because we get that instant feedback with forward facing sonar, but it's like fishing in winter, is there a time limit? You're going to let it soak for 2 or 3 minutes before you try to do it again and drop it right back down in the same spot?
We do. I think that's really important. And when I learned how to do it, I thought that was the craziest thing. Like, you're just supposed to let it sit there. You're not going to shake your bait. That goes against everything that I've ever learned, but it works. And I do, Ronnie. I let it sit there 2-3 minutes at a time. The wind will actually drift your boat a little bit. So you're holding it still, but that bait is kind of moving like this just a little bit. But yeah, we've done that. It's 2-3 minutes doing that, and then you'll reel up, move a little bit, drop down again. But one thing we have, it's really frustrating, is that, like we talked about, how they get adapted to it, is they'll come up and you can see them on your graph, come up and look at it, and they'll just sit there. So a lot of the times, I learned this from other guys and from my cousin. like reel it up real quick and then drop it back down, and those fish will react to it. And a lot of times you can make them bite that way.
One big mistake I feel like that I've noticed, but also people have said with that is, with that technique, you're never targeting fish that are feeding downwards. They're never going to be picking it up off the bottom, unlike other things like a jig. And so even if you accidentally let that bait fish fall, you know, your Demiki rig fall below them, if they're 2 feet off the bottom and it actually goes past them a little bit, that they know that's not natural. The bait fish aren't going to just come down and hang in their face. They're gonna stay above them. Is there a happy medium for you on how far you like to keep it above them, just to see that reaction? You know, if you get them to rise up or you get them to do one thing or another.
I mean, you know, they're exactly what you said. They're chasing shad, and if you'll think about it, you know, shad's going to try to stay away from a bass. So I like to keep it, you know, just close enough to where they can see. You know, 3 foot. I'll go 3 foot off the top of a boulder or something like that. And a lot of the times, like I said, they'll come up and look at it and go back down. But you definitely want to try to get a reaction bite out of them. But I like to keep it 3 feet away because they're feeding on shad. They're not very active, but when they do get active, you know, you can catch several. But yeah, rambling
So,
there.
No. I want to backtrack a little bit because obviously everything we've talked about has been, you know, in your words, like the 55 and below temperature range. Let's say early December, sometimes into middle of December, depending on what the weather's been like. When you're talking about that mid 50s range, obviously, you know, White River Lakes, East Tennessee, anywhere with rock seems like that's a great water temperature for cranking and you know, just winding a crankbait down the bank. Tell me some of the places that you're looking for when that's the, you know, the temperature range, when those fish are still on the bank feeding on crawdads, things like that. Tell me, you know, some of the places you like to look, and then even some of the bait you'll throw, because, you know, despite it being December, I fished Logan Martin the other day and the water temperature is still mid to high 50s. I mean, a lot of those fish have not moved out. So when that's the case, just give me a rundown of kind of, you know, the places you'll look and then also the bait you'll throw.
In that range, you know, I really like the banks that aren't as flat. Not necessarily, they don't have to necessarily be bluff walls, but like transition swings, creek channel swings, things like that, where they can access deep water. That's usually always where I've caught them cranking late in the fall. As far as bait selection, I've always done good with just a flat sided crankbait. Um, the Fritz side, usually the deepest one I like, but any kind of flat sided crankbait, that's usually been the best. And like I said, sometimes I've had winters where it's the water stays in the 50s all winter, and you can literally catch them through December, January, basically into the spawn in that area. So.
Well, I'm going to pose another situation with you. In Arkansas, I like to have this rule of thumb. Kyle probably knows this rule of thumb since he grew up here. But if the weather is ever 55 degrees or below in Arkansas and it's around wintertime, fall, it's about 100% chance of rain. So in the wintertime, it goes from being 80-degree water temperature right before Thanksgiving, and it hits when the transition is very, very paper thin. And so like this week and last week, we've had 4 or 5 days of 35 to 45, maybe 50-degree weather, and it's rained all day long. So for you, how do you approach places like that? Let's just say Cherokee got a bunch of rain that's not going to necessarily raise the water level. It could dirty it, but it's also going to dramatically cool the water off. Is that first 5 feet of water a no-go for you? Or is that's new oxygenated water? That's maybe some color in the water. Is that the place you gravitate to? So there's probably 2 types of fishermen. That one's going to be avoiding that dramatic change, and some are going to be looking for that change because it's the difference that we're going to have.
Yeah. My mind goes directly to Lake Cumberland when you say like the water doing that. You can find out pretty quick if they're on the bank. I believe if there's fish shallow, you'll get a bite within an hour, I believe. But I like it when it dirties up the water, not too dirty. But if it gets dirty, I feel like a lot of those times the fish, especially when it gets dirty in areas where it's usually never dirty. I feel like the fish kind of just go crazy. I've had days on Cumberland, specifically in the fall, where it rains and rains and rains, and the water doesn't really come up much, but it dirties it up really well, and you can just catch a ton on a crankbait. But if it's super cold and that temperature drops significantly, you'll find out pretty quick if they're up there and if they've started to move out, towards their wintertime pattern. So,
and it even seems like maybe you can hit on this a little bit. Seems like at least in my experience, whenever that stabilizes, if that water stays dirty over a course of time versus it might get dirty right then, and those fish might not be acclimated to get up there. But if you get that scenario where that water dirties up and it stays dirty for a week, by the mid to end part of that week, those fish almost have no choice but to go to the bank because it's not like they're just going to hang out deep.
Yeah, completely agree. That's especially like you said, if it's doing that for a week and later in the week it's still that color, you're right. Like it can get really, really good. Especially I just popped in my head is run-ins as well that time of year. Cumberland has a lot of those, and they will absolutely stack up in places like that.
Like it got me thinking, like I know we're talking about rain and that influx and that sudden change of weather, but it reminds me of the team championship a couple years ago when I covered the event at Norfolk Lake in Arkansas. I lived in Arkansas. I rolled up to the event and it had been warm all week leading up to it. Water temp was like 52 degrees, 53 degrees, but the 3 or 4 days of practice and tournament, it was frigid. So I could drive down the lake and point at a guy and say, he's from out of town. That's a Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas team. He's from out of town, because everyone was fishing slow and they were fishing offshore because it was cold physically outside. It was cold, but the water temperature wasn't there yet. And every single top 5, top 6 team was from Arkansas, Missouri, or Oklahoma. And they were throwing top water. There was one on a plopper because everyone thought it was frigid, but the water temperatures didn't reflect that yet. So I guess how long do you normally see a weather front like rain? Or like rain probably immediately affects fish. Like they feel it. It doesn't take but a couple hours and they're there, versus a cold front where you feel it building. It's going to get colder. It's going to get colder. But after maybe 3 or 4 days of it staying cold, then those fish are like, okay, now it's time to change. Have you noticed that between those two different types of weather fronts, rain or dramatic cold?
Yeah, definitely. Rain, like you said, can change them overnight. But with really, really bad cold front, I'm thinking of Chickamauga right now, where this past year, remember how cold it got, but the water temperature, it still took a while to cool down, and we were still 3-4 days into that cold front, nights in the 20s, we were still catching them really shallow on the bank. So I think there's a big difference between that. I think the rain kind of speeds up the process, but if a cold front comes through, the water temperature is the main thing. So it can take a pretty good amount of time to change that.
So one thing we typically try to hit on towards the end of the podcast on these pattern of the months, give us your top 5 like baits for this time of year, just in general. And it might take you a minute to think of it, or if you can only come up with 3, that's fine too. But just give us like your top baits for fishing in December.
If I'm not in a tournament, obviously number one's got to be an Alabama rig. It's basically cheating. So so that's got to be number one.
Now,
just that fun.
do you like to change up that in Tennessee? I guess what is it? You can have 3 hooks on it, and if so, do you like to have one swim bait different? And how do you arrange that? Because it is something that it's kind of everyone can throw that technique, but it's a personal preference on how they arrange them, the head size, the colors, things like that.
Yeah, I do like to change the middle one. I will, the one that sticks out. I usually go with a little bit brighter color on that one, just because I feel like that's the one they target. But as far as like the head size and everything, just depends on how deep I'm fishing. Usually a couple 1/4 ounce ones on the bottom, and actually 3/4 ounce is usually what I go with, and then 2 at the top that are just like 1/16 ounce. Cut the hook off so it doesn't turn to the side to make sure. you've got the 3 hooks always on the bottom. But that's usually my go-to on the Alabama rig when I can throw it.
So before we move on from the Alabama rig, another question I have is, with the 3 hook minimum or maximum, I guess rather, do you go with 2 dummies or do you add 2 extra blades up at the top? Because I've seen it work both ways and people do both. So what is your preference on that?
I've done both. I usually just go with the 2 dummies most of the time. Sometimes, if it's sunny out or something, I'll throw a blade on there, try it out for a while. But most of the time, I just go with the 2 dummies.
I thought you were talking about us, Kyle, with the 2 dummies. So I'm glad it went a rig direction, not us. But yeah. So yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we'll let you carry on. So number 1 would be Alabama rig, and I'm with you 100%. That makes that makes 2 dummies like me and Ronnie actually good at here.
Yeah. Probably the next would probably be the Mickey rig. Obviously we've talked about that. That's just a go-to pattern in the wintertime in the lakes around here. Third is, which is probably my favorite, is just the Ned style bait. I know a lot of people do not like throwing a Ned rig, but I absolutely love it. Smallmouth love it. Just a great bait, not only in the wintertime, but year round. And then float and fly, great bait in December, and probably a finesse jig. Those are probably the 5. Actually, it's a close fifth with a finesse jig or a blade bait, like a silver buddy. We used to throw that all the time, and before the Demiki was out, you could throw it in the places where you catch them on a Demiki and catch a lot of fish. So probably the silver buddy. Yeah.
I feel like probably the majority of people listening probably understand what a float and fly is, but maybe for somebody that doesn't know what that is, just explain that, because I'm sitting here thinking there's probably people listening. They're like, "What in the heck is a float and fly?"
It's almost forgotten about these days, but it's basically like an 8 to 10 foot limber rod with super. I usually, how I rig mine, I'll just go through the whole thing, is I put 10-pound braid and I'll tie it to a three-way swivel. And on that 3-way swivel, you've got your braid and then a bobber and then a leader. And I usually go with a 6-pound leader, somewhere around the same length as the rod, usually 8-foot leader, with a 1/8 ounce fly, just a real small fly. So it's a very subtle, good wintertime presentation. Basically what you do is you cast that out there, and when it's sitting up, the bobber will be the orange color, and you want to just shake the bobber and try to keep your bait in the same place. And basically it's really boring, but you're shaking the bobber, moving almost like you're crappie fishing, and you'll move it a little bit closer to you. And each cast can take up to 5 minutes, but I've caught a lot of fish, and a lot of people think it just catches little ones, but I've been proven wrong on that several times. So
is that one of those things where the 8 feet is your go-to because of the rod length, but do you change that leader based on how maybe fish are suspended or not suspended? Like if you did see them on 2D back in the day, or that this is the depth here, do you vary it that way? Or are you going to change it up in another way so you don't drop below them, or you're not way too far above them?
Yeah, I've gone up to, and it's hard when you have the 3-way swivel. If you do straight fluorocarbon, you can adjust your length a lot easier. But I've seen guys, and it's the craziest thing, catch them with a 15-foot leader, and they're reeling it in, and they'll have to literally like have somebody help them take the bobber off so they can reel the fish the rest of the way in. So yeah, I will adjust it. It gets it gets kind of hard because when you go to move, you've got to take that leader and basically like wrap it around everything and put it on your eye. So it's hard to go with a leader bigger than your rod, but I've done it before. It's especially if the water's clear too. If it's super clear, you can have that leader anywhere from 13 to 15 feet. So, but I usually start with like an 8 to 10, just because it's not as big of a hassle.
And when you're at
Also
15
makes
feet,
it
you walk to the back of the boat and let your partner net it at the trolling motor so that you don't have to reel it all.
Yes, yes.
it's also very difficult to cast as well. I mean, that's not
Oh yeah,
not an
yeah.
easy
That's
thing to cast.
no.
You thought casting a Carolina rig was tough. What do
I
that?
mean, even with an 8 foot leader, I've hooked my dad before. Like it's just whipping that little fly will come by your ear. It's a difficult thing to cast for sure.
So it does catch big ones if you caught your dad with it as well.
Oh
So
yeah,
um
yeah, real big ones. Yeah.
well, I will say this. We've talked about East Tennessee and fishing there in the wintertime in December, as it starts to hit wintertime there. But it's also a time where you guys start to head south for Florida. So briefly, if you have gone down around Christmas time into Florida, what do you normally like to target for somewhere down south where they're definitely a season ahead of where we are, in Arkansas and Tennessee? Are you going down there with sight fishing in mind in December, or you get to go and actually pre-spawn fish Florida if you do head south for the winter?
Um, I, especially for our tournament, I really don't like to target uh, spawning fish. I will fish in areas where I know they're spawning, but as far as looking at the fish and catching them spawning in Florida, it's something that I'm not very good at. So I try to stay away from that, but I will, target areas where I think they're moving to and I think they're spawning. Keeping a close eye on the weather, and the water temperature and things like that when we go down there. But um, I've fished Okeechobee a ton in my life. We used to go down there every year, but the problem is we were, shiner fishing. So I'm basically going, I know great areas. I'm assuming, those fish will be in those areas, but it may be a little more difficult to catch them on artificial. So, but I'm really looking forward to going to Florida and I think, by that time of the year that, I think we're starting maybe a week later this year and a little further south. I would say the fishing's going to be, really good.
A little bit more stable than it has been in the northern part of the state, the time of the year with fronts and stuff. But Kyle, do you have anything else for Mike when it comes to pattern of the month before we let him go?
I do not. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to talk to Mike about, like I said, a lot of things that bring me back to my childhood, getting to fish over in East Tennessee, and things that having obviously lived in Arkansas and now in Alabama, there are things that apply to a lot of bodies of water. I mean, pretty much if it's not a giant grass lake, pretty much everything that we've talked about today is can be done on other places. So mainly just thank you for joining the podcast, and like I said, I've really appreciated getting to talk to you about this kind of stuff.
No problem, guys. I really appreciate you having me on. It was a lot of fun.
I'll say this one thing. We need to get another start of the elite season, not down in the Sunshine State, and get it maybe another Cherokee or another season starter like that. Maybe we can, if it's later in February, we can maybe do Cherokee and maybe a Chickamauga in first week of March, or we could do a Cherokee and a Cumberland first week of March. Who knows? But that would be a cool way to get pre-spawn back into the schedule. Or even late winter back into the schedule. We haven't had that in a little while. So I know you'd be excited about that. And I don't know if we can get your nickname changed or not, but you're not as mean as everybody says you are. And I'm going to just call it, we might nickname him Nedhead Huff or something because he likes the Ned rig so much. But
yeah,
that'll be a good one. Yeah, Nedhead Huff. Well, Mike, we'll let you go. Appreciate you joining us for the pattern of the month for episode 104 of the Inside Bassmaster Podcast. If you want to know anything about East Tennessee fishing, maybe Southern Kentucky fishing, Mike Huff's the guy to go to. Mike, appreciate you, man. We'll talk to you, I guess, in a few months when the elite season starts.
Sounds good, guys. Thanks for having me.